disappear on the per capita?
Yes, in delta little y over y, that can't grow at rate n, right? Because it's in per capita terms. Recall that because technological change allows output per worker to increase in any given labor stock, then that is the only way we can actually increase our per capita income once we hit the steady state. Yeah, question?
So the diminishing returns principle doesn't apply to technological.
That's exactly it. Or it's a way to combat diminishing returns. Okay? Now, where exactly did technological growth come from Solo? He doesn't really say. He describes it as manna from heaven. Okay? Technological growth, the rate of technological growth is exogenous. That's the key. That's why in all the literature, if you search exogenous growth model, you'll find the Solo growth model. That's why the endogenous growth model got its name. Okay? This rate of technological progress, we just don't know where it comes from, according to Solo. That's why for mature economies, this is a core insight from Solo. In mature economies, once you hit your steady state, once you reach a very high level of capital stock per capita, you need to have technological progress in order to continue growing. And that explains why industrialized countries never seem to reach some steady state that Solo observed. Okay? Any questions on issues 1 or 2? Experts? Why don't we take a 5-minute break? You guys definitely earned it. And yeah, we'll start from there at 7:10 on that.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, don't worry about it. Yeah. Oh, right.
The last part. I think.
Friday, what about you? Yeah, early.
It's a challenge for
I'm gonna get a
all incoming students generally.
Yeah,
You have some. Most are like
They don't cancer more twice. It's just crazy.
I
don't normally look at this.
No. I've been looking for a pair of tops that high.
Anthropology, Oakland, California, like years ago.
Okay.
But
yeah.
Anthropology store.
just real basic stuff.
There's just in there. They seem to be doing wide leg pants instead. Lots of leg.
Yeah. You're covered.
Yeah, and
What's that?
Excel.
Ah, okay. Oh, really? Do you need this?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know how to do it?
Shoot.
I can stick around and try to help you figure it out. 'Cause I'm not gonna put it up.
Hey Neil.
Yeah.
Before you erase that, I don't understand how you go from the change in T times L over T times L and how that equals the change in Y.
Because remember the output is still a function of L times T. So remember, just pretend T wasn't there. Output would have to grow at a rate of n in order to keep per capita income constant in steady state.
Okay.
Right now, it has to grow at n plus theta to keep income per effective worker constant in the steady state.
Okay.
It's the same logic.
Okay.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, no worries about it.
Did you got it?
You support it still? Think about sitting in a windowless box for 2 hours.
You're gonna be here.
Yes.
Alright, so on the note of China, I guess this is kind of the most shameless thing I could possibly do, but I actually wrote an article about it, so I wanted to pass it out for your consumption.
You wrote it yesterday for us, or?
I wrote it in April, I think. When was this? Yeah, April. But I wrote, it draws very heavily from the theories of this class. That's why I think it's beneficial to you. I posted that in 5 minutes. Yeah, Jürgen?
Just again, before we start, the rate of depreciation, is that sort of not the effect of wars? That wars destroy everything and the depreciation goes away, so you basically start from zero? Or start
If
from
we had
zero?
wars, the depreciation rate would go sky high, right? Because the pre-existing capital stock would get destroyed.
Yeah, but it will go back to infinity or zero?
The depreciation rate would go very high, I guess, to infinity, because it would be a rate sufficient to destroy the pre-existing capital stock. That's a good question, because if we look at the high growth rates of Germany and Japan after World War II, there's a solo argument to be made here. We had S times Y here, right? And their capital stock got completely destroyed. Let's say it fell here.
Yeah.
And then they had very, very fast growth back to their steady state.
Yeah.
Right? But yeah, in terms of depreciation, just think of it as like a war would be like a discrete fall in the capital stock per capita. Think about that. Okay, great. Evan Hume is having a TA session after class today. He's covering how to graph things in Excel, in case you want to know. And I think he's going to do his own solo growth problem. So in case you're interested in more support, it'll be available to you. Also, I wanted to draw your attention to the Interactive Basic Calculus for Economics courses at SICE DVD, prepared by Dean Harrington. He also has an interactive pre-calculus course. Why are these interactive, Sam?
I don't know. I think because you can answer questions.
There's exercises in
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so this is truly an interactive course experience. If you have any questions on the math, you're looking for more support, you can check these out on reserve from the library, okay? They're available. You can check them out overnight, as long as you have them back in the morning, I think. You can even take them out for weekends, right? In the summer? When? Yeah, maybe. You don't read the library? Okay, so with all that said, I want to just move right along, and not to worry if we don't finish everything in this outline. The lecture on Tuesday is on the shorter side, so we can easily cover the two-sector models or even the conclusion then. So, strengths and weaknesses of the Solo framework. Now, it has certain market strengths, okay? It's far more sophisticated and powerful than the Herod-Domar model. Now, why might that be the case? Well, recall that in the Herod-Domar model, our production function looked like this. It was very simple. There's no room for labor. Okay, the solo growth model accounts for labor. And based on the Herod-Domar model, is capital increased, income increased with it. And that process could happen for as long as we had capital accumulation. Remember, that's the core optimism of the Herod-Domar model. It didn't take into account diminishing returns. So that in turn is a strength in the Solo model because it allows for decreasing marginal returns to capital and also reincorporates the role of labor. Secondly, the Solo growth model focuses on the transition to the steady state just as much as it focuses on the steady state itself. It seeks to explain why countries with a low pre-existing capital stock per capita might grow faster than countries with a high capital stock per capita. It supports the conclusion that we see right now that emerging markets or less developed countries have the capacity to grow very, very fast. And finally, it incorporates the role of technological progress. It doesn't tell you where it comes from, but it admits it's important. Those are three core strengths of the Solo framework.
Sorry, can you say the first one?
Yeah, it's more sophisticated than Herod-Domar because it takes into account decreasing marginal returns to capital, and it also incorporates the role of labor. Right? The best way to envision this, just think about their various production functions. Right? Diminishing returns, labor is included, versus Herod-Domar, it's just I-core and capital. Right? Now, Solo's focus on capital accumulation and productivity growth as proximate determinants for the steady state also raises with it a new set of questions. Okay? The first is, are we focusing on the right things? Now, it's one thing to say that, okay, we just need to increase our savings rate and decrease the population growth rate, and that will lead to a self-sustaining cycle of growth until we hit the steady state. But Solo says relatively little about the role of institutions in fostering economic growth. So those institutions include states, right? This market doesn't assume a particularly large role for government. The role of IFIs, or even markets institutions. It doesn't take into account geography. The Solo growth model applies to a landlocked country just like it would an island country like Japan or England. It ignores political stability, macroeconomic stability, and it's arguable that those factors actually matter more than simply rote capital accumulation in explaining growth. Furthermore, Solo doesn't really provide a full understanding of the precise pathways through which these factors influence output and growth. He doesn't explain why necessarily capital accumulation will lead to increases in income. I.e., perhaps the link between capital accumulation and income is severed for whatever reason. Why might that be the case? Why might capital accumulation not lead to income growth?
It's poorly invested.
Very good. You accumulate capital, but you build a bunch of factories that produce horrible things. Or you produce them, you have a large nominal value, and then you go through a revolution, right? There's all these kind of empirical factors that inhibit capital accumulation from necessarily translating into income growth. Another weakness of his argument is the whole idea of convergence. So recall that Solow claimed that rich countries, or really all countries, had the capacity to be rich countries. They needed to raise their rate of savings, lower their rate of population growth, allow for leakages of technological innovation across borders, a diffusion of ideas, a diffusion of technological progress, and all those things would lead to convergence in per capita incomes. Now, if we isolate the sample and look at Western Europe, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, there's arguably a strong degree of convergence among those countries. Yet the world is far bigger than that. So we have to explain why is it that convergence didn't happen in so many places. Now, other weaknesses include, I'm just going to list these, a lack of insight into the factors that actually create the steady state. He just kind of claims it as such. Doesn't really talk about depreciation, where that comes from, population growth rate, where that is what that's influenced by, etc. Also, it's a one-sector model. Okay? It assumes that there's just some output in the economy. Does it tell you the composition of the output? No, it's just income per capita. It's not agriculture and industry and manufacturing, military. It's unisectoral. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, technological change is purely exogenous in his model. He doesn't seek to explain where it comes from or how we can influence it.
Sorry, what was exogenous?
Technological change. He just kind of claims it comes from heaven to improve nations' per capita income. And on that point then, that transitions very nicely into the theory of endogenous growth. Endogenous growth theory actually tries to account for where technological change comes from. Now, if we accept what Solow said, that technological growth is the key driver of sustained increases in per capita income, there has to be some semblance or an explanation of where these things come from. Now, Robert Lucas and Paul Rover identified 4 potential sources of increases in technological progress. 4. The first, recall that in the Solow growth model, what kind of returns to scale did we have? Constant returns to scale. What they claim is that it's possible that we have increasing returns to scale of production. Increasing returns as opposed to constant returns. Now, what would that do? Well, it would raise the return on income. It would raise the return on capital accumulation and labor accumulation vis-a-vis income. Which would also allow for greater per capita income. Increasing returns to scale of production usually relate to efficiency gains by mass production. That's a form of technological progress. Second, they talk about the potential for positive externalities. So, before we jump into this particular point, what are externalities? Who can give us a good working definition of that? Yeah, Wynn?
Costs that go into a product that aren't included in the final cost that are passed on to the
Okay, that's a good way of thinking about it. What else? That's kind of negative externality. What?
Or
Yeah.
say a benefit.
A potential benefit, right?
Subsidies,
Subsidies?
I think.
You think those have potential spillover benefits? Yeah, well, we can talk about that, particularly subsidies for innovation, industrial policy. Well, the best way to think about any externality is it's some value that's not captured in the final price of a good. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, let's use an example of a positive externality. Anybody get the flu shot? Yeah, you did?
Yeah.
You get H1N1 and the regular one?
I didn't study anything
So-
about how it worked.
Oh, really? That's how nice. Well, that's interesting. Do you think they gave it to you just because wherever you work, they're just very benevolent? Presumably a law firm at which you work, they're just
They want
nice.
to keep us healthy, so,
I see.
yeah, we can be more productive.
You can be more productive? Well, that's fair. So, well, that's a completely separate discussion. But I think the point is that there's actually two benefits to a vaccine, right? There's the actual benefit accrued by the person who gets the vaccine, but who else benefits from that? Everyone else, right? You're less likely to be a carrier of a disease, and in turn, you're less likely to affect people even who haven't been vaccinated. That's a positive externality. Can anybody think of any negative externalities?
Pollution.
Pollution's a case in point, right? I also think loud music it can create enormously loud, horrible negative externalities. I mean, just think of like the teenager who just gets his license listening to like, Metallica or something. So those are all examples of externalities. So how does this relate to economic growth? Well, it's possible that we have positive externalities to regular garden variety economic activities. Things like learning by doing, that by virtue of specialization in the productive process, employees discover more efficient means of doing things, thereby increasing their technological progress. Right? If I figure out some magical way of teaching you guys and imparting the solo growth model in 10 minutes as opposed to an hour and a half, that will be considered learning by doing or a positive externality of simply teaching. Right? Spillover effects. Things like synergies and clusters, right? I think Easterly calls these leakages or leaks in, I believe, chapter 8 of his book, which is assigned for Tuesday. So he kind of goes over why it is that we have these spillover effects, why it is that knowledge necessarily diffuses from high concentration knowledge to low concentration knowledge, and how that can be a source of income growth. Now, along with the notion of positive externalities, we can think of the idea of clusters. Now, what's a cluster in the economic sense? Why is it that many technology companies in the United States tend to be located in Silicon Valley? Maybe the weather might be one determinant, but it's otherwise a relatively arbitrary location.
Universities?
I'm sorry?
Universities?
Okay, access to good research universities like Stanford, etc. Okay, that's one example. What else? Yeah.
Labor force.
Labor force, right? Think of it. If you want to do tech in America and you want to work for the best firms, it helps to work in Palo Alto. Yeah, if you're from the perspective of the actual company who's hiring these workers, it also helps to be in Palo Alto, right? So we have these industrial clusters form that allow people to collaborate more, to take advantage of the fact that they are geographically in the same place. Now we have clusters in other industries as well. We don't have many financial services in Omaha, Nebraska, except for Warren Buffett. Most of them tend to concentrate in places like Hong Kong, New York, London. We also have the seat of government and lobbying. Lobbying wouldn't be particularly effective in Rochester, New York, in the same way it would be in Washington, D.C. So all of these things allow for us to have gains in human capital, which would allow us to take advantage of technological progress.
Are you saying this is an externality, or is this actually one of the third points?
These are ways in which the externalities come about. And it's the positive externalities of us just, I'm doing activity A and you're doing activity B and we're doing it in the same place. By virtue of doing it in the same place, we're more productive. We can bounce ideas off one another, we'll be more likely to innovate, come up with the next big thing, etc. Right? And somebody mentioned universities. I think universities are kind of premised on the idea that if you got a lot of smart people in a room, they'll be able to innovate and create good research better than if they were working in kind of atomized workspaces spread across the country. Now, what's the policy implication of endogenous growth theory? What's the major big one? Now, in solo growth, what was it? It was the government can influence growth by increasing the savings rate, facilitating investment. There's not really, it's time to enter it, yeah?
You can create, you can create clusters and positive externalities through like special economic zones.
Sure. So this increases the scope of the role for government in economic development. That's the big insight from endogenous growth theory. The government can provide things like funding for research and development, providing infrastructure for clustering. How about a strong property rights regime, including patents that allow for innovators to capitalize on monopoly rents of their innovation? All of these things are within the policy latitude of governments to increase research and development. Example, in the United States, you guys heard of DARPA? You know, that's a kind of case in point. They arguably invented the internet because of funding from Al Gore, which allowed the nascent internet to be formed by a group of people who weren't motivated by a profit motive, which then led to kind of the path dependence of the last 30 years of economic growth in this country in information technology. Now, when externalities in new investment are large, for all of the reasons we've talked about, decreasing returns to capital accumulation do not necessarily set in. So growth rates need not necessarily slow down.
Can you say that again?
Sure. When externalities from new investment are large, right? For all the channels we were talking about, clustering, etc., it's possible that capital accumulation, that decreasing returns to capital accumulation might not set in. I.e., you can get out of the path of diminishing returns. And thus, growth rates do not slow, and the economy does not necessarily reach a steady state. Now, obviously, this argument of whether or not we can influence growth by virtue of policies adopted by the government is at the heart of many of the debates taking place right in Washington right now. Ultimately, it's tough to know whether or not the United States is rich because it innovates, or it innovates because it's rich. Right? These are all kind of difficult questions. Endogenous growth theory seeks to answer them. So, just curious, what percentage of you guys believe that the government can create conditions for innovation? That it's kind of a self-directed process that the government can influence? Yeah? Okay, about half. And who thinks innovation is just kind of random? It just happens. It would happen. We had to have the internet if anybody could have made the internet, right? Really? Oh yeah. Okay. Why do you think that?
I went to Stanford.
You went to Stanford, so
my friend was employee number 30 at Google. Yeah.
Number 30? Wow.
Yeah.
You must be very, very wealthy.
What's that?
Did you catch the IPO boat?
Yeah,
Excuse me.
David Sergey Brin, and yeah.
Oh, really?
I took him out for dinner on my expense account and some baking, and he asked me about the IPO process. So yeah, I would say
Wow.
it's not random.
That's great. You'd say it's not random. It's
I would say it's actually
oh, it is random.
pretty random.
Yeah, I mean that's this is kind of an interesting part of social sciences in general. You know, like when we study why wars occur, why countries get rich, these kind of big level questions. There's a school of thought, often led by Nassim Taleb and some of these guys that claim that we just don't know where these things come from, and that any attempt to know is just kind of futile.
But I have
Yep.
a question then.
Sure.
Well, to my classmate as well. I don't think that anybody would disclose anything that they would invented if there were no some policies imposed by the government. If you don't have property rights and patents, you will invent something and keep it to yourself.
That's a great point. But
And
what
just
about
hope
open
that
source
nobody-
software?
Yeah, I know, but I mean, when you think about it, that's why I think these policies are in place, so that you have some protection over what you invested. That's why you share it with society. And that's why states like the US profit from it, because they have very strong.
I think that explains private sector activity for profit very well. But I'm curious, I mean,
Yeah.
why is it that people just invent cool tools on the internet then? Is it just because they're goodness in their
I
heart?
think
Because
it's
they already-
their mind, they function like that.
Yeah.
No, but I guess because they already have an established base. They don't care anymore.
No, I don't know.
They
They don't
probably
care.
have already. They
Maybe
probably
they're
have.
maybe they're just really rich and they want
Yeah,
to invest. Yeah,
exactly.
it's possible. Yeah. Yeah.
There's actually an argument from the book Inventing the Internet, which is that because of the way the government project set up the internet, that the whole idea was basically just open source and let a bunch of guys do it for kicks, and that culture has continued. And so that's the hacker mentality, and that's why there's a lot of open source stuff, because that's what's considered cool and important within the primary culture.
So you're saying there's a cultural determinant for why some countries might innovate more than others?
I think you can set up conditions for just about anything.
Okay, interesting. I mean, no, I would tend to agree, but I think now we're getting out of the realm of economics and into sociology. But no, I think that's a powerful argument we have to consider. Yeah, Win?
I mean, I think those two aren't like necessarily mutually exclusive, right? You could have people who, you could say that, you know, some people at random will invent things and the government can't facilitate that process. So perhaps,
Sure.
you know, that process went on randomly, you know, for most of human history, and then, you know, with better conditions provided through governments, that, you know, process accelerated. I mean,
Yeah, that's a very rational response, I think. It sounds like it's very, you're kind of triaging between the two camps, you know? I think that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, if Brim had stayed as a child in...
I'm sorry, can you?
If Brim, the executive of Google,
Yeah.
had stayed in Russia or Soviet Union, then this would have never happened.
Mm-hmm.
We would have never had the opportunity. I'm serious.
You don't think so?
No, because I mean, in the interview, he said that he thanked his father 18 years after when he brought him to Maryland in the US for immigrating at that time, because as a Jewish in Soviet Union, the guy couldn't just do anything.
Interesting
Because of the closed
question.
society, because of the restriction, because of lack of freedom or democracy.
Yeah.
I remember listening to a debate on the estate tax, and the one who was arguing in favor of the estate, keeping a big estate tax was Bill Gates Sr.
Yeah.
And he said, if my son had been born in a less developed country over in Africa, we would never have had Microsoft. And you know, we benefit from all these, from being in the U.S. So it's only you know, good policy and fair
Sure.
to have this big estate tax on Gates's. Of course, took all his wealth, put it into a 501c3.
So, yeah, exactly. The Gates Foundation, where a lot of science students work after taking this class. Some of them, anyway. Yeah.
I guess I have 2 points. I completely agree with you. You have to look at the fact that at least for the first 4,000 or 5,000 years of human history, it had to have been considered random.
Yeah, there weren't even states, right?
There weren't states, there weren't
It's
governments,
tribes,
there was no reason, but somewhere or another we figured out that you sharpen the rock, it kills the animal better. So there's some randomness, but you also still look at today and your hacktivist groups and your youth, and they don't have big pocketbooks, and yet they sit around on the internet all day and make up new toys to, granted, destroy our lives, but
Motivated from some, perhaps not strictly profit.
it's not,
Motivated
they're
for a
not
whole host of
usually
different
creating these for profit, they're usually creating these for the sake of, I mean, Anonymous hacked H.B. Gary quite well. Not for the sake of profit, but the guy who was the CEO annoyed them, so they wanted to see how far they could get and destroyed the company.
Fascinating. The high world of hackery. I don't really know anything about it. It's interesting though. Yeah. Maybe you know?
Yeah, well, it seems to me that from a decision-making point of view, you're not going to concern yourself with, is it possible that someone's going to come up with a good idea? You're always trying to increase the conditions for the probability. So whether or not, it can be both ways. Like when said, that's not really a concern from a decision-making policy-making point of view. You want to create the conditions that increase probability.
Yeah, I think that's
Possibility
fair. No, I think all that's true. I also think that I guess as we kind of debate what we're gonna do as a society after the global financial crisis, most economists agree that they take some form of the solo growth argument or the endogenous growth argument and say that the only way to really grow is through innovation. And that ultimately, whether or not the state has a role to play in it, that's up to debate. But as we look, even in advanced countries, this innovation debate it's really important, because if we can innovate our way out of the current kind of malaise of the debt overhang that we've accumulated for the past 30 years, that might be a faster way out than just simply paying it back over time slowly but surely. And so there's a huge macroeconomic stability component of innovation that often gets ignored in dialogue. But anyway, a heady debate. It's interesting to see this, very few people on the randomness side. Or I guess you guys have triaged between the two camps well. All right, so let's talk about the two-sector models now. We've covered Solow, Herrera-Domar, and endogenous growth theory. There's no real model associated with endogenous growth. It's more qualitative. So spend some time looking at that and just kind of looking at how we can actually facilitate innovation. But the two-sector model is a pretty stark departure from everything we've seen before, because it assumes that capital and labor combine to produce more than one product. Capital and labor combine to produce more than one product. Now remember that empirically, large structural changes take place in economies as they grow economically. What are those structural changes? Urbanization, increased percentage of industry, is percentage of total GDP. All those things are important. So we expect agriculture as a share of GDP to actually go down and industry for a share of GDP to go up, even if aggregate agricultural production goes up. Okay? Now, these two-sector models measure differences in growth and productivity in unequal sectors and focus on the allocation of capital and labor inside a given economy. So enter this labor surplus model. Now, David Ricardo, writing back in 1817, most science students are aware of this guy for creating the basic trade model. He was quite the Renaissance man. And he argued two basic assumptions. Okay? The first is that agricultural production is also subject to diminishing returns to labor. Agricultural production is subject to diminishing returns to labor. And secondly, in primitive economies, and I'm using that with air quotes, the industrial sector then could draw away labor surplus from farms without decreasing agricultural output. Now, the way to envision this...
Can you repeat that last one?
Yeah, sure. So because agricultural production is subject to diminishing returns, then in most quote-unquote primitive economies, the industrial sector could hire workers away from the agricultural sector without decreasing total aggregate output in agriculture. Without decreasing. Yeah. Okay? So,
And who said that?
David Ricardo. So this, of course, can be represented graphically as follows. We have the quantity of labor employed in agriculture on our x-axis, quantity of labor employed in agriculture. We have our total agricultural output on the y-axis. And we have some production function. Let's say at this point, at point D, diminishing returns have set in. Diminishing returns have set in, and the marginal product of labor is equal to 0. Make sense? Think about it. As we hire more labor, right, our agricultural output remains fixed. So we can graph this relationship of the marginal product of labor and claim that we have some supply curve of labor in agriculture. So on the x-axis, again, we have the quantity of labor in agriculture, and we have the marginal product of labor in agriculture. Now, absent any distortions, what wage would we pay all laborers? What wage? How are prices determined in supply and demand? Intersection between supply and demand. Gordon? No. Okay. So that would be the case in our labor market, yet it's not. Why is it not the case? What wage do we have to pay labor? It's a minimum wage, which we describe as the subsistence wage. A star. Right? At the end of the day, you have to pay labor enough to survive. Back in the day, things weren't as rosy as they are today. So the key here is that if a labor surplus economy starts with its entire population in agriculture, okay, it can remove a large part of that population and move it into industry without any commensurate fall in agricultural output. I'll repeat the whole thing, but just think about it, okay? If you have everybody employed in agriculture, okay, so you have these masses of people employed in agriculture and nobody employed in industry, and we're at the point past diminishing returns where the marginal product of labor is zero, it's possible to hire people out of agriculture, out of the farms, move them into industry without any fall in total agricultural output.
Because of the land. You can only supply so much land for agriculture. It doesn't matter how many people you can employ on that land. So if you remove a number of people that are surplus for that piece of land, of course the output will still be the same.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So once we hire those workers out of the farms and put them in the factories, it's possible then that we could grow industrial output without decreasing agricultural output because of the surplus labor. Now, the third and final graph associated with this talks about that particular relationship. So we have an industry supply curve of labor. Okay. We have some marginal product or wage paid to people who work in industry. And then we have the supply curve of industry labor. Notice how the supply curve of industry labor, right, is one labor pool in this economy. So it mirrors that here of the agricultural supply curve, right? Because they're hiring from the same pool of workers. Okay?
Why does the agricultural supply curve start at 0 and the industrial supply curve starts at some point above 0?
At some subsistence level? Well, you can think of it this way. The industrial supply curve starts at the subsistence point,
Oh, okay.
whereas the agriculture supply curve, truly if they were to offer nothing, right, there would be, very little labor employed, right? And yet, because you have to pay the subsistence, you end up employing all of these people, right? It's the notion of a price floor, right? So,
Sorry.
yeah, question.
Okay, so you've got the supply of agricultural labor there. Why is the horizontal axis labeled quantity for agriculture? What's the distinction? I'm confused.
Oh, well, the greater the quantity, the greater the price you pay, right? The greater the quantity supplied will be of labor in agriculture. So it's a basic supply question. Yeah. So the key here, let me finish this up and then open up the questions. Let's say we have some demand here, right, for industrial products. Okay? Let's say we demand a greater proportion of industrial products. Here's the key. Because the labor supply curve of industry has a very large, perfectly elastic portion, that's horizontal, perfectly elastic portion of the labor supply curve, it's possible that we can hire more labor in industry without driving up wages in industry. Thus, it's possible for the total aggregate output in this economy to increase without A, decreasing profits of firms because they don't face higher costs, and also without decreasing agricultural production. As long as there's some way of moving food consumed by industrial labor, as long as there's some way of moving the food consumed by industrial labor from the rural and urban area, industrialization can proceed with a fall in agricultural output, thus allowing for economic growth. Make sense? This particular model is premised on the fact that developing countries have lots and lots of labor and very, very little machinery or industry. It assumes that there's two sectors and that one sector can grow without doing anything to the total product of the other sector. That's key. Okay? Yeah, question?
I think though that when you were addressing the industry model there, you were saying that within the sector, it's possible to increase labor without decreasing wage.
Without increasing.
Without increasing wage, yeah. Because it has such a large elastic portion,
right?
Because there's just so much labor, right, that you can pay, 1 cent above the subsistence wage and get them to work in industry.
Oh, I see.
Okay?
Which means there's a lot of running room before costs start to rise.
Exactly.
Productivity is
That's exactly it.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but from sociology, I kind of remember, this is what happened in the beginning of the industrialization.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah,
how they did,
people argue that.
that's why they grew so fast.
Definitely. Yeah.
No, I think this now answers my question from class 1 about urbanization. When I asked what happens to the agriculture output if everyone leaves villages and go to the cities,
Mm-hmm.
and
Who will produce the food?
right, or who will work in the fields.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, from the developing world perspective, it will not affect the productivity
Mm-hmm.
of agriculture because you have supply of people to work there.
Yeah.
This is the answer. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Based on this model, yeah? Yeah.
And because the technology that advanced countries have developed is transferable, that means their surplus is almost infinite, right? At the point at which they started,
Yeah, when they're completely an agriculture economy. Is that what you mean? And so they have tons and tons of people they can pull into urban areas, yeah. Mm-hmm. And I mean, arguably, I hate to keep using the example of China, but China had very, very low wage growth for the first 20 years of its development. Okay, you could argue that this is partially why. Okay, moving people from the countryside to urban areas, paying them marginally more just to get them there.
When did they hit the point of wage growth?
They're kind of hitting it now, actually, with very large inflation in wages, which is arguably eroding, as you can read in the article, is arguably eroding away their firm's profit margins and sending production further south. And the question is, can they rise up the value chain? Who knows? Yeah.
What about all the people in very poor countries involved in agriculture who aren't producing any income, net income, they're just subsisting and feeding their own families?
Mm-hmm.
Is that consistent with this
Yes.
model?
Because they're still paid some subsistence wage, right? Just to be kept alive. Yeah, Jürgen?
Is it a similar relationship between now industry and financial services or services when we move today from away from agriculture to industry, industrialization into the service?
That okay, so let me get. So you're saying that the industry would be the equivalent of agriculture, and that the that's
Like
and that you can hire. What's that?
Like manufacturing industry, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, empirically, I don't know if that's necessarily the case, because you look at the countries that are most specialized in the financial services, they have the tiniest manufacturing sectors that have contracted quite a bit since, when they started diversifying into it.
But
So
overall output is still extremely high because of productivity gains.
yeah, definitely. But in terms of whether or not the question, the analogy would hold if production in that first sector remained unchanged. Okay, so the production in the first sector doesn't remain unchanged, even if aggregate income goes up. Okay, just think of Britain and the United States and contrast that to Germany and even Japan. Yep.
It's been a number of years since undergraduate, but is this the same?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Is this the same model as the guns and butter? I think that Sachs proposes.
I believe it's different.
Okay.
If it's based on the guns and butter thesis, it's different.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I saw a question hand in this vicinity. No, mine? Yeah. You look like you're thinking about something very profound. Don't speak share. Okay. All right. I do not want to rush through the two-sector model. So the the neoclassical two-sector model. So why don't we end it there? Unless there are any more questions. No? Okay. Evan will be holding a TA session immediately after this. So we can maybe take a couple minutes to make sure the monitor works, Evan. Sound good? Yep. Aside from that, this weekend, try to do your problem set. Please don't leave it to just the Wednesday before. You'll be confused and very frustrated. Take a crack at it. Try to do as much as you can because feel free to ask Evan and me questions. Take a crack at it. Say, hey, I'm having a problem with this piece of analysis. Take a look at my math. Where am I going wrong? That's okay. It's a collaborative process in that. Okay. Okay. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.